Good afternoon, Professor York here. Hope you all are doing well. This is Tips for Great Presentations, and this is part 2 of our 3-part series. This one, we're going to focus in on slide and Q&A tips. So let's move along a little bit. What we have set up in terms of our 3 buckets, or 3 parts to cover in this presentation is cheat sheets. Okay, so things to think about that will help your slides, because I've noticed in some of the presentations the slides could definitely take to another level, and I think this is what we're going to try to do, is give you some tips and some cheat sheets. Second is some examples of some of the slides that I've seen from past classes that work really, really well. There may be some tips that may be gleaned from those. And then last and not least, a very critical part of a presentation, which is the Q&A. So let's go off to cheat sheets. Okay, so what about some practical tips? Okay, so cheat sheets, okay, for better slide decks, and these are some things I talked about already, but I think the title, as we talked about with Michael Alley, should be a takeaway message. Every slide should have a take-home point. You should minimize your bullets and try to think about more graphics that are there. And if you do use text, break it up. Use boxes like I do, or in the case you see, I'm using SmartArt. Okay, use builds, especially for busy slides where you want to break and call out certain points. And this is particularly for complicated slides. And last but not least is, as you work within 3 sections, you might have a section head or an anchor where we would have maybe icons, 2 or 3 icons that would designate either on the bottom or the top in terms of which section you are in. In addition, font and background contrast is critical, and don't just take for the contrast that you see on your computer. Get and project your slides. It's amazing what you think looks good on a computer. You go into a room that may have some ambient lighting and find out that your font is getting blurred out. I really push for contrast. That means a dark background with a light color, or a light background with a dark color. Okay, so that's very important. Should have consistency throughout in terms of your template and your theme that is there. You're trying to come across with a brand image and look. And that consistency is in your fonts, in your headers, in terms of, are your headers all capitalized or all lowercase? So these are things that you need to think about. One of the other things that I found in many of the presentations is that they lacked references, and usually we have references that are put in the lower left-hand corner, and that's classic for the scientific world that we do that. But in the business world, it helps build credibility when you have data. It doesn't allow for the audience to start asking, where did you get that data? And then on the lower right-hand side, we generally like to have a page number on each slide, and that helps you keep track in your mind where you're at in the presentation. But also, if you need to go back somewhere in the Q&A, you know your page numbers. And then check for typos and grammar. Very, very critical. It's amazing when you can have a great presentation, but you spell words that are wrong. And what's nice about PowerPoint and Word is that there are various editors or editing functions that you can run a spell check and grammar check through, or you can get a more commercial piece of software like Grammarly, and I do encourage that because it really helps and it makes you look your best. And then for the Q&A, which I'll talk a little later about, is have an appendix, okay, with titles and page numbers, and that helps you handle that Q&A, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, also is the rule of what we call 3 or 4. Okay, we already talked about in terms of the pyramid principle about 3 buckets, but even within slides, 3 or 4 in terms of grouping of content and separating of content. And colors, no more than 3, no more than 4, but generally the rule of thumb is about 3. In this case, you see in the slide I have 2 items. So you'll see many times I try to keep things within 2, or if you have a bullet list, put it into a box to group it out, and it just helps. It's visually, and it's also for processing by your audience that's there. So that sort of gives you sort of some tips from cheat sheet standpoint. Let's go into some examples that might be helpful. So how about some examples? Well, here's one that we had for, and this was more from what we call a slockument, which is sort of a combination of a presentation, but also is a take-home document, and many consulting firms will use this type of format rather than a written report to give more detail. You see this also with a lot of market research companies. But let me just highlight a few things. Notice here you have a headline. You have anchor points through the story. You actually have a story arc, that it is, which is basically the roadmap to entrepreneurial success, I think this is. And as you can see also is we have a page number. Here's another one that we actually use in helping to find out pitches. And what I've done is I use the rule of 3 here. I have a lot of elements of what we call in this cheat sheet for setting up a pitch, but I set it up in terms of set it up, deliver it, and then make the case in terms of 3 buckets to work with. And then as you can see, the content that goes with each bucket. Notice how I've used the smart art and the color contrast. So we have the rule of 3. They have a headline, so we have here's the roadmap and a page number. Here's from one of my teams that work with the California Cyber Security Institute. And what I like about this slide is, number one, is they put the text on the left-hand side, and that is best practice from speaking PowerPoint. They also have section anchors. They have a headline. They put their data on the right-hand side, so that's also a good practice. Is figure a picture should actually be more on the right-hand side when you have text. They have the references you see on the lower left-hand side, and they have bullets here, but they put in a box. So this way you have basically 2 or 3 elements to work with visually, and you have a lot of data to be able to use a box to emphasize specific data that's there. And likewise here, as you see in this slide, is a page number. Here's a setup for SCQR. This is a team that worked with California Closets. So you have the rule of 4, SCQR. So sets up very nicely the pieces of the story with the recommendations to move forward. Okay, and also a page number, which they didn't put in the lower right corner, but what they did was they put in the middle. But what I like about this is they have anchors. So in each section you can see that these anchors will tell you which section you are in. So this is a nice little example, and that might be something to consider as you work on your presentations. Here is, I do believe, yeah, the same team as well, and you know, they're using smart art, and they have a nice headline and anchors again. So, and keep in mind the rule of 3. Here's again rule of 3 by another team that worked with California Closets. Oh, they got an anchor, used an icon for an anchor, this time in a headline. And then what they did was they alternated using graphics for each of their recommendations and some text on the bottom. And I think what I like here is, notice the font and background contrast. I think they really did a nice job in a very artistic fashion. This group was very, very good with their slides. Here's something from a team I worked with up at Berkeley last summer when we did a presentation. So this is your classic SWOT analysis. And SWOT analysis are just horrendous. And I've just seen folks take 5 minutes on a SWOT analysis, and basically your audience has tuned out or has fallen asleep. And so I was working with a gentleman who was going to present it, and what I said is, let's have a bottom line to this slide. So you see on the left-hand side, take-home point. Okay, CVS Health is an established player in the industry with a huge complex. It needs to focus, so that's the strengths, and then we have the weaknesses that are there, and then looking at the opportunities and threats in that. So within literally a 30-second hit, I've gone through that slide, which easily this could be a 2-minute or 3-minute slide. And when you're working with a clock, you need to think about your headlines to move through. Other things I like is section anchor. I do like the graphical presentation of the SWOT analysis in the box. I probably would have a little more contrast to the color in the background, to the font. And with bullets, you notice that there aren't 10 bullets. They're not overkill, and the statements are not overly too long. Last but not least is there's page number and references that are there as well, and you have your anchors. And an implementation plan example. This is something that later on in a presentation you have an implementation plan. One of the things I like is the headline. I like the tasks. One of the things that fell off on this slide is in terms of the contrast of the content that is there relative to tasks and responsible. I do believe it's because they were being hid and we were allowing for these to be able to come out with an animation. But it's a real nice Gantt chart style that really gets the point home very, very critical. This is very important, I think, to keep in mind for when you are presenting and talking about next steps is in terms of tasks, responsible, and timing. I will look time and again for this and will be grading accordingly in the presentations, both in terms of interim presentations as well as final presentations. So that gives a few good examples that are there. I'm sure you could find some better examples, but I thought these were some things from students that we've worked with that it stood out. And they illustrate some of the key points that we have relative to cheat sheets. So let's progress into the last area, which is the Q&A, which, believe it or not, can make or break your presentation. So what about this question and answer period? So first and foremost is that in your presentations you get anywhere from 2 to maybe 5 minutes of Q&A. And sometimes some folks are going to pose some very tough questions. You'll see this with executives. So the first rule is never be defensive. Never push back. You think you can win the argument, but you lose the war, and it could be career limiting. So not defensive. Thank person for their question. Maybe ask them to repeat the question that is there. Make sure you're aware of your nonverbals when you're responding too, because you might say, oh, that's a wonderful question, but you're like really negative or your body's really closed. And it's like, oh, geez, I really just shot myself on that one. One technique we like is posing questions, especially if you have a group that is quiet. Oh, you're quiet. Ooh, I'm so overwhelming and wonderful. No, you're not. It's just that maybe folks are just like trying to still process it. So what we call this is an icebreaker technique, and I've seen this with teams using this technique that they've actually been able to open up and get dialogue. Sometimes you got to put the foot in the water first before everybody else decides to jump in. You should have an appendix, and this is very critical that I see a lot of folks do. We pose a question, I have 3 people, 4 people answer it, you waste all the time, and you have people in the audience get a little irritated that they didn't have an opportunity to ask questions. So one person per question, answer those questions to the point. All right, set up an appendix and organize it, okay, in a sequence. That it's not that it's an important way of doing it, but think about and anticipate your questions that are there. So here's an example, okay, that you might think about, anticipating your questions in your appendix. So you have appendix of point A, B, C, D. So separate page, okay, title, and one thing that we also like are page numbers, and then use what we call reciprocal hyperlinks. And what I mean by that is choose the title or choose the appendix and create a hyperlink to the slide, which you can do in PowerPoint. And then what you do within each of those slides is that you create basically a back hyperlink to this table of content. The other thing you can do in PowerPoint, if you are in presenter view, you can, and you have your slides that are projected out, and then you have a presenter view which gives you next slide. There is a version where you can be able to, on the presenter view, go into what we call slide sorter, and then you can pick your slides if you have to jump around rather than flipping around the slides, which just look really unprofessional. The other way of doing it is right-clicking your mouse, and you'll see slide number, and you can go, if you've made slide numbers and know your slide numbers, and you can do that. The point being is you want to look professional, you want to work smooth, and you want to be able to be efficient with your time, especially when you have tight Q&A sessions. So here's another appendix table of contents that we have with names, and here's the slide number. Okay, page number. So it's a really good example of this that I've just pointed out. This was from our CVS team that was there. And here's some icebreaker questions that are there. Don't have to have a ton, but you might just say, hey, is the problem here really about finding a digital solution, or should it be reframed? Which aspects of the digital product that we had do you see most compelling? Notice how they're open-ended question, okay? Or I'm giving choices. How significant do you see the pharmaceutical care positioning as a key point of differentiation? So anyway, hopefully from these three pieces here, again, another 15, 16-minute little snippet, I've been able to give you some tips around, first and foremost, your slides, in terms of some tips on your slides, and then in some examples, and then closing out your handling of the Q&A. Anyway, we're got the second of 3. Take some time to digest. Look at how you can apply it to your presentations moving forward. And we're going to get into part 3, which is going to get into the actual presenting and closing issues. All right, have a great afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you may be. I look forward to seeing you guys in class soon.